Mini Sculpting Super Show. This is episode number 7. I'm your host, Tom Mason, and today we're going to be talking about putties. First putty we're going to cover in this series is Greenstuff, or as it's officially called, Tight Blue Yellow. But as you can see by this modern day packaging, they have named it officially or unofficially Greenstuff. So as I said before, Tight was designed by Polymeric Systems Inc., but not originally as a sculptor's putty. It was actually designed as a plumber's putty. It's really good for that actually still, and I have patched up my own plumbing with some of it before, and it's still holding fast, so that's cool. But anyways, which begs the question, why was this used by sculptors as a sculpting material? And to get that answer, we have to look back many decades now at this point, definitely the 80s, possibly before that in the 70s, and to where this first came from. This was the oldest putty, as far as I know, that's been used for sculpting miniatures. I'm sure there's been other, I know there's been other materials because this game isn't infinitely old, but this was originally used by Games Workshop sculptors and other famous sculptors you might have heard of, such as Tom Meyer, and then from there, through his influence, he disseminated the knowledge to tons of other sculptors who worked at Real Partha. You have people like Sandra Garrity, Dennis Mays, and tons of other sculptors that worked for Real Partha and then continued on, and then from them on to everybody else basically. So at one time or another, all of the old guard, I guess you'd call it, of sculptors, this is what they used. Now the current packaging and the way this is sold and distributed here, Greenstuff, it comes in this long tube, little paper wrapper with a lot of information, and unfortunately I don't have a more full version, but it comes in this it's a two-part epoxy, and it comes in two tubes with the yellow, which is the resin, and the blue, which is the hardener. Didn't always come like this. Originally it came in the form of a tape, which had the two materials butted up next to themselves and just wound up, and it was very nice actually. And as you'll notice here in this picture, you'll notice that there's actually more yellow than there is blue. And so what you would do when you were ready to sculpt, you would cut a small piece of the tape, and that would be what you'd mix together. However, you had to always make sure to cut out the center middle part because that would have partially cured elements in it since it had been touching the whole time, which is why they ended up going to this method. That way you wouldn't lose any material. But the big thing that I was pointing out about the tape is that there's more yellow than blue, and this putty was actually designed to be used with more resin than the yellow, than the hardener, the blue. You can of course do different mixes. You could do straight 50-50. I tend to prefer to do more of a 70-30, maybe a little less, but I like a little more yellow. Makes the putty more malleable. The more hardener, the more blue you put in it, the firmer the putty becomes to work while you're working it. It's not as soft, and there can be good, and it really comes down to preference. But originally when it was made, it was designed to have more yellow than blue. Before I get into too much more detail on the properties of Greenstuff, I want to talk a little bit about how to take care of this stuff. So with all putties, and I'll repeat this information for the other videos as well, but for all putties, freshness is a big deal when it comes to it. If you have very old putty that hasn't been stored properly, it can be a bear to work with. And if you have a bad batch and you're not able to reconstitute it or get it working, then I suggest throw it away and buy a whole new one. It is not worth fighting it. So the way you keep your putty fresh is as soon as you get it, whatever you're not using, you pack it up. I like to keep it in its container here, like this, but then also put it in a Ziploc bag and then put it in your freezer. And you want to let it freeze. And that will basically completely put it in suspended animation, and no air or moisture will typically affect it, and it will be ready to go at any time. Basically, you just pull it out of the freezer whenever you're ready to use it, and it's recommended that you let it thaw for 24 hours. That just helps to make sure that it's fully thawed and there's no excess moisture build up or anything like that. But that is the key to keeping your putty fresh. Now, if you don't do that, you get a nasty film that can start building up through that, and the putty itself can actually become I don't know, it almost feels like it's drying out, which it probably technically isn't, but something's happening to it. So you don't tend to get the film on the blue hardener, but on the yellow, you will actually start to feel it, your putty will get less sticky, but it's not the whole thing, it's just the outside. And it's because it's actually starting to change, and it almost feels like there is some sort of plastic film over it. And that once that starts to build up, it won't mix properly, and if you do take elements of the putty, the blue and the yellow, and you mix it together, you'll actually end up seeing, when you fully blend it, you'll see these flecks of little, they usually end up looking like little rectangle pieces of look like little thin pieces of plastic sheet in there, and that's just the skin that won't blend in with the rest of the putty. The blue isn't as bad, but it does, like I said before, it can kind of toughen up and feel dried out. So you want to make sure you're storing your putty so you can avoid that. It is possible to reconstitute the putty to a degree if you get some rubbing alcohol and just put a little on your finger and rub it around on the surface of the putty, on the blue and the yellow. This is before mixing. That can kind of break down, but usually only works if it's not too far gone. If you have some putty you've left out for months, then it's usually better to just throw it away, get a fresh batch. You know, you wouldn't draw with a dull pencil. Don't sculpt with bad putty. Next, I'd like to talk about the working environment for Greenstuff. It's actually recommended in their on the inside of this little wrapper here. It has tons of information and data about the putty, and this is all just recommended stuff. You know, for one reason or another, you might want this varied, but they recommend that when you're mixing it, you'll be working at about 75-degree environment. I'm usually working a little colder than that, maybe 70. Sometimes even 68 in the winter, but we'll get into that in a minute. Anyway, but at 72 degrees Fahrenheit, the Polymeric Systems says you will get 1.5 to 2 hours of working time, and it will take 24 hours to completely harden. And that's if you do basic, 50-50 or a little more yellow in there. Now, your actual working time might be less than that, because that's one of the main things about working with putty, is that depending on the temperature of the room and the exact amount that you've mixed, it's constantly curing and changing. So when you first start, putty's very soft and very sticky, easy to put on things, but as time goes on, it gets harder, so you can't manipulate things around. But it can also be a good thing, because it stays put, stays in place a little easier. So there's pros and cons throughout all that. Here's a typical mix of putty that I will use for Greenstuff. As you can see, it's about, it's eyeballing, but it's 60 to 70% of the amount is the yellow, and the rest is the blue hardener. And the way you mix this is you get your two individual, and I like to size it up like that before I do it, although you can always add a little bit in after you've started to mix it. But once you have your amount, you just kind of start pressing it together, and then I like to fold it over a couple times, just to start stretching it together. And I spin it between my fingers. You've probably seen me do this on a few other videos, but I figure since this is the video about green stuff, I'll show you exactly how I do it. All right, so now it's fully blended. You don't want to see any streaks of blue or yellow in this. This is a very nice pure green. It's a little light green. That's how I like it. That's how I prefer. Obviously the darker it is, that means there's more hardener in it. But this means it's very sticky, and it's very soft, so I can make it very thin and basically apply it anywhere in any way I need. Now, this was very easy to mix. I'm just going to do another quick callback to the temperature thing. It is probably about 68 degrees in my house right now, but my hands are nice and warm. They're not cold, and that's a big deal when you're working with putty, and even with clay and Fimo. But I find it even more important when I'm working with putty is the temperature needs to be just right. If it's too warm, everything can be way softer. I like my putty soft when I'm working with it, but it can be way too soft if it's too warm. But if it's cold, it can also be much harder to mix and much harder to manipulate when it's on the figure. So a couple tips for that is keep your house at a nice temperature, or something I do when I don't want to be running heat in the whole house is I will actually keep a little space heater nearby and just pop that on every now and then. And if nothing else, I'll put it right on my hands, make sure everything gets warmed up, let it hit the putty a little bit, and then everything's good and ready to go. So let's talk about some pros and cons for green stuff. I don't use it exclusively when I'm sculpting, but I do use it for a lot of things still. So here's what I see the pros as. It's very sticky. Now, that's the first one. A lot of people don't like that, right? Because it's difficult to use. You have a metal tool and it sticks. This is actually popping up pretty good, probably because this tool is so much colder than this. But, it can get stuck. The green stuff can get on your tool and get things gummed up. But it's a big benefit how sticky this is, because you can apply it to almost any other substance and it will stay, and then you can sculpt. And that's very handy, especially when you're working on small little detailed areas. Some other putties that aren't as sticky you can't use, because you can't get, if you're doing a tiny detail, you put it on and it won't stay. So that's very, very important. You actually can also use the stickiness to your advantage, because, and you'll see this in my further demos videos that I'm going to do specifically on putty in the future. But you can actually use the stickiness where you let it stick to your tool and then you pull it some, and you can get some really neat, interesting effects by allowing the material to stick to your tool. But it is a challenge to learn that, and it does take some time. The next advantage of green stuff is it does have a long working time. They say 1.5 to 2 hours. It's not going to be the same consistency throughout that whole cycle, but it is the longest putty I use, longest Cure Life putty that I use, and you can continue to manipulate it to quite a degree for a good solid hour, which sometimes is good, but sometimes it's bad, because sometimes it's good just to do what you need to do and be done. Now for some of the cons. Main con of green stuff is that it does what is called blooming when you heat it, when it gets too much heat, when it's not fully cured. So let me explain. When you first mix up your putty, you sculpt a nice detail. Let's say you're doing an armor plate and you manage to get it really nice and sharp, or even part of a face or something, a body part that is organic, but maybe there's some sharp angles or nice cuts that you've made into it that are very nice and crisp. Well, if you take that and you put it in a putty oven to help speed up the curing process, which is a key technique you should do when you're working with putty, it will start to bloom. And what that means is the heat starts getting into the the putty, and it actually expands, it blooms out, and it starts to round and soften all the details. And it can ruin a very nicely detailed piece. The only way around that is to let your figure sit and cure for a certain amount of time naturally before hitting it with heat. Once the green stuff starts to set up more, the blooming is greatly minimized. But you need to make sure you don't do it too soon, and that you don't cook the putty too hot when it's still curing. The other con is that it can be somewhat difficult to achieve sharp angles while sculpting. Part of this is just the fact that, like I said, it's very easy for the material to bloom and become rounded, but just it's a very gummy material, you know. I'll show you on here again. If you pull it, you know, a lot of it doesn't just pull a small section. Everything stretches out, everything moves with it, and you have to learn to control that. And if you don't, then you can mess up details. So, you know, even as we take this sharp blade, we press in, you see, hopefully you can, let me lubricate a little bit. It pulls, as I'm pressing in, the elements on the sides are actually pulling in and rounding down with it. They're not just opening up and letting there be a slice in there. And even if you slice it, that helps some, but there's always going to be a little pull that happens because of the stickiness of the material and where it drags it. And part of the way you can mitigate that is by letting it cure. Once it's set up more, not completely, but as it becomes more cured and starts to harden, you can actually, it loses some of its stickiness, and you can drag across and make cuts that way, and sometimes even press in and be okay. So what's Greenstuff good for? Well, you can use it for entire figures. It's been being used as the primary sculpting material for miniatures for decades, and it's still being used by many sculptors. I personally don't prefer to use it for whole figures, but it totally can be. For me, the ideal use is for small details where you need the material to stick easily, or going to have a very thin element, because you can spread Greenstuff super thin and still work detail into it. It'll stay put, and it's just great to work with that way. Things such as hands, small, thin ropes or jewelry, elements like that, anything like that, this is just great, and I use it for that purpose all the time. So why did the modern golden age of miniatures, as far as our hobby goes, why did they decide to use Greenstuff for sculpting when it's such a, it's considered a pretty difficult material to learn to use and master? Well, it's because it is probably one of the most durable things out there, and somebody figured out you could sculpt with it. It can withstand a huge amount of heat and pressure. I believe it can withstand up to 325 degrees Fahrenheit and up to 2,000 pounds per square inch. So not only can this does it work well with the traditional vulcanizing mold process, it will survive, and you can reuse the master over and over again. Or heaven forbid something goes wrong with the mold, you know, the figure's still there to use again.